Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings, Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I'm a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you are here. Today's conversation is with the multi-talented Mr. David Pearl. David is a performer, author, director, and public speaker who has established himself as an innovator in business, the arts, and social change. In his early years, he sang at the Royal Opera House as the boy soprano soloist for 4 years. Later, he played double bass and toured as a member of the London School Symphony Orchestra and the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. David is a creative force who has pioneered the use of arts in business and works as a creative confidant to high-profile CEOs and their teams across the globe. He is the mastermind behind Experience Engineering, a method for designing and leading high-stakes, high-impact meetings, as well as the creator of Story for Leaders, which helps harness the power of narrative and leadership. As an author, David has penned several insightful books, including his most recent work, Wonderful: Human Navigation for a Complex World, which aims to awaken our innate guidance systems to help us navigate through life's complexities. He's also the founder of Street Wisdom, an international social venture that brings experiential learning to city streets across the globe. And finally, David is also the creative mind behind Wonderful, a podcast designed to bring a bit of wonder to your walking. David, welcome to Curated Questions.
I'm honored to be here, and you have a great voice for podcasts. I wanted to say that.
Excellent. I will receive that encouragement. Plenty of folks have told me that I also have a face for radio. Thank you.
But you've got the assurance of a kind of, this is your pilot talking, and everything's going to be fine. So I feel in very safe hands.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, let's see. I often start the conversation with, when did you first understand the power of questions?
Now, I knew this question was coming because you were kind enough to let me know in advance. And I've been dwelling on it, and I'm trying to be as honest as possible. And I think it's not an exact answer, but I'm sure other people listening, as a kid, had a sense that there were things I was being told that weren't so, and things that were so that I wasn't being told. Do you know what I mean? And I think we'll come back to that maybe, because I think that feeling has stayed with me. And so I think underneath, though I didn't frame it this way, I think quite early on, and you mentioned you're kind enough to mention my singing. So I had this strange, slightly Cinderella childhood. So by the age of 9, I was a professional musician in some ways. And so I was living this kind of adult child life. But I think the question underneath it was, really? It was the word really. And that stayed with me, a sense of like, is this real? And if it is real, are you serious? So there's a kind of, I was even thinking maybe that would go on, if I have a gravestone, it might go on my gravestone, because for me, there's something about testing reality to see if it's real, and also being kind of amused and slightly perplexed by what you see. I think if you look out into the world, a lot of people are going, really? Is this really it? So,
especially today's, yes.
Yeah, I mean, especially today's. I don't know if that helps you, but I think that's in the core of me. There's a kind of, really? Is that what's going on? Is that real? I mentioned in Wonderful, I had a kind of, I had some early experiences, good and bad, that exacerbated that curiosity. One was hearing the great Placido Domingo sing in the Opera House, the first real opera singer I'd heard close up, and I was like next to him. And at the age of 30, it was his debut at the Covent Garden. And I have to say that hearing that much concentrated beauty and power close to you kind of
Wow.
made me think that what people call reality isn't real. This is real. The rest of it is a sort of toned down sepia version. And the other thing that happened to me, which is much less pleasant, but I was there when my brother got involved in a car accident. He survived and he's fine. And I spoke to him this morning. He's a successful man. But actually sort of essentially seeing your brother killed in front of you, as far as I knew,
Wow.
also upended things in a way that I like to think wasn't entirely unhelpful, because though I wish it hadn't happened, I came away feeling like if reality can be turned upside down so quickly, it could be turned back the other way very quickly. In other words, what was stable and grown up and predictable isn't that way, which in some ways gives me, in the work I do, hope and energy, because you feel like it's nowhere near as fixed as you think it is. People say things are fixed, but they're not. So I'm sorry, that was a bit of a circumlocution, but I think that's behind this question I quite often ask, which is, really?
Just the simplicity of it, I love. It's actually rather audacious to challenge, because the systems that we have in place that we've built through the millennia is what we're living with. And that simple question, that one word with the tone at the end, that upturn in the tone, I can only imagine challenging anyone, the stuffy person in the business suit that has all these years of experience and built things this particular way. And just by going, really?
Yeah.
For someone that says, this is so, I think really can be powerful.
Yeah, Ken, it's interesting to hear you play that back to me. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I agree. And the way you said that reminds me that one of the things that I think I do when I'm working in organizations or in these structures, in these real things, so-called real things, consensus reality, I think, is what the process psychologists would call it, or the Jungians. But basically, sometimes just asking a question is enough to have the person asked, to have them reassess what's going on. So a lot of people running around the business and want to give advice, and I'm one of them, I'm sure. But I have a wonderful mentor called Charles Handy, who's a philosopher, and he's the master of the lightly asked question that leaves you going, huh. And I think the example I often use is, you go to your grandmother and you say, you're in bits, you've split up from your lover, and you say, oh, Granny, it's awful, I'll never love again. And she's got two choices. She could say, there, or she could go, never. And your granny does the second, because what she wants to do is wobble the jelly that is your reality, and you figure it out, because you go, well, not never. Oh, so not never. Whereas if someone tells you that, so I think the way you played that question back to me really can be very, asking a question, and this is the basis of all of your work, I'm sure, but asking a question can be a real gift for somebody, because they then figure it out and they own what they discover. Like at the end of meetings, I'm known as somebody who, I'm known as the meeting doctor sometimes, because I've done work on meetings, because I actually think meetings are beautiful. They can be amazing. People roll their eyes, but actually in the post-industrial society, people meeting and sharing ideas is the work, actually. But I'll often say there'll be people, particularly there'll be a senior person, and all the junior people say, come on, tell him how to do it better, or tell her how to do it better. And the simple question at the end of the meeting, so how well do you think that went, is a really good question. Because usually the people go, well, it could have been better. So what would you have done different? And they're onto it, rather than criticizing them. So how well do you think that went?
Yeah.
It could have gone better. So anyway, I'm now very much in your hood, the question hood. But I'm about to say to you, Ken, there's definitely value in asking questions. I'm about to explain that to you on your podcast about questions. So I should just be quiet. Let's get back in my box.
No. Please, all you're going to do is just validate this. So I mean, part of what the work that I'm seeking to do is
Mm,
democratize questions and
mm,
asking questions
mm,
and saying that, yes, it is okay. And ask in whatever corners you want to go into, but it's appropriate for us to go ask those questions. So it's an element of permission, if
mm,
you will,
mm.
and encouragement. It's both. So by virtue of your conclusion that yes, questions need to be answered, well done.
I got there. I got there. I mean, it is really hard. I think it's a really lovely idea to democratize questions and allow people, including in their own mind, to ask the questions. Somehow you
Mm,
need to give sometimes permission to do that. I think that's fantastic because there's such an emphasis on answers. I had a CEO that I worked with. He's a wonderful CEO, one of the great leaders I've met, and a really brilliant, amusing, engaging communicator. And he's tired, and he was fed up with the fact that he
mm,
seems to end up with like lots of stuff on his shoulders. So I was working with him on a big conference we were doing, and he explained what he was planning to do. And I said, I hear you, but why don't we try this? And so why roll forward to the opening of the conference? He walks out and he says the words, any questions? And there's a
mm.
ripple of laughter around the room because normally he's open with an interesting anecdote and sort of thing, and he's off to the races, right? And then he went, no, any questions? Again, and now less tittering in the room. There's 400 of his people there. It's like, what's going on? He said, have you read the strategy document? And people sort of, there were nods and bits more. He says, okay. And you still have no questions? He said, okay, let me tell you. He said, under your chair, we've taped a copy of the strategy. I'm going to leave for 20 minutes. And if when I come back, you haven't got any questions, the event is over.
Wow.
And off he went.
Wow.
And it was really great. It was really great. There's a really great turning of the tables in a really helpful way. It's just like, because what essentially a lot of leaders find that the more charismatic, the more capable they are, the more in some ways people expect them to do the work in a kind of way. You know, it's like, I got this. But actually, again, asking the question rather than giving the answer, so powerful in that situation.
And the results of that, did he kind
Well,
of,
it was an interesting moment in that I wouldn't say the content of the questions were that earth-shattering, but the cultural shift is still
mm,
remembered today because it reminded people what we like to say is, I can't say what company it is, but it's a great American company. But one of the phrases we use there is, knowing our business is your business.
okay.
So there was an element of, guys, if you're at this level in the organization, you have permission. In fact, you are obliged to ask questions, to your point. This is not, you're not a junior, you're not just accepting. It's like, ask the question. And actually, so interesting, because like you did with me, if you had the stage and you were told to ask or invited to ask a question, what question do you ask? You know, this is your moment. You know, the new N is listening. What dice do you roll? It's a really great provocation, I think you've got there.
To come back a little bit regarding that growing up experience, did your parents encourage, I mean, were they forward leaning on developing curiosity and whether it's challenging reality? What did that look like?
Good question. I mean, I wouldn't say explicitly any of those things in the sense that we sat in a circle on beanbags talking about that. Wasn't the way it was. They were super busy and it was the 70s. And what I do think, so I'm going to say, and like a wild generalization, I come from a Jewish family, and I
Okay.
would say there is a little bit more of kind of prove it to me kind of attitude in that culture. It's sort of built in the sense that Bible study, as I understand it in Judaism, is you learn the Talmud by sitting opposite somebody and arguing. I think that's why Jewish households can be quite noisy, and also why there are quite a lot of Jewish lawyers, is because you litigate from an early age. But I also think my dad was somebody who particularly, my mum too, they both sort of defied reality in that they come from quite humble beginnings and had done really well for themselves, sort of broken that sort of routine. But also my dad was an interesting guy, and I didn't realize he was interesting. I thought he was normal, but he was a dentist, but also a barrister, and then eventually a judge, and then finally an artist. And he had degrees in this, that, and the other, and was a collector. And he was one of these, he was a polymath. But I didn't know that's what you called it. I just thought that's what you did. And it's only later I realized the fact that you were kind enough to describe me as multi-talented. But I think that I was away from school the day they told you, you've got to do one thing. So I've always been doing, I'm a singer, yes, and I run a charity, yes, and I do this working business, yes. And at times it's been mystifying and frustrating because people at a party go, so David, what do you do? 7 minutes later, their eyes have glazed over and I'm still trying to find a good answer. But I think in that regard, it was a challenge to the reality of you do one thing and you do that, I am a dentist. And it was more like, no, I'm a human that does this and does that and to the other. So I think that was built into that was the progressive element, I think, that was probably built into my childhood, yeah.
Certainly those various identities, if you will, seems to map that you're doing essentially what your dad did as far as these different things and pursuing these different ideas and challenges and not being willing to, well, I guess it's just expanding and wanting to go pursue those instead of saying, no, I am only this. So,
yeah, it's also greediness and FOMO and a ridiculous short memory about the last time I said, I mustn't do this again. And I think it's actually when my father passed away, I remember thinking, I said to myself, advance on all fronts. And it had there was something about his legacy to me in some ways. I hadn't thought of it. In fact, I haven't thought of that till now. But there was some sort of sense that to counterbalance any sadness, it was like, no, advance on all fronts. And there are all sorts of logical reasons why that isn't a good idea. But I do think I do that in some senses. I'm expanding. I'm quite contextual. So I'm in a situation and I'm all in, I think. And then I forget that the next day it's a different situation and there's still work to do from the first day. So, and in a way, I'm a little bit playing catch up. But it puzzles me. The really part of me goes like, why don't more people? And I don't, it's not be like me, but I'm puzzled and very compassionate. I'm very fascinated. Well, people sometimes say to me, why do you work in business? Isn't that boring? And I have to say, first, working in the arts, the delivery can be exciting, but the process can be incredibly boring, by the way. And arts organizations can be some of the most stuck and least interesting behind the stage. But also, I'm genuinely curious about what it would be like to be an actuary. It couldn't be less like me. I'm not particularly good with numbers and stuff, but somebody does that. And there's a part of me that goes, wow. So that's I think the curious part of really. I sat next to David Frost's widow. Do you know of David Frost? He was an interviewer who interviewed President Nixon famously. And during the interview, Nixon kind of sort of conceded, I think he confessed regret or whatever for the whole Watergate thing and so on. And he was a brilliant interviewer. And I sat next to his widow and she said to me, he had 3 questions, 3 things he'd say to people which made him a brilliant interviewer. And they were, really? Uh-huh. Tell me more. Those are the 3 things he said. Really? Uh-huh. Tell me more. And I often mention that to senior people I'm working with, which is like, don't over-index on what you're going to tell people. See if you can draw out their story, because it's fascinating. And you learn more than just trying to lay your reality on top of somebody else's reality. Men particularly have to work on this. My experience has been women a little, I don't know, more naturally empathetic. In fact, a friend of mine said to me the other day, and it's something that I've never quite thought of this so simply. She said, oh yeah, women have to be empathetic because they've got to figure out how to stop a baby crying. And I just thought, That is, I mean, that's assuming they have a baby, and it's assuming the baby cries and not making all sorts of gender assumptions. But there is something in that. You have to learn non-verbal communication because you've got this thing you care
Absolutely.
about. It's true also of men. I love being a dad, and I loved the early days as well, and so on. But I thought it was an interesting point.
Beautiful. Why has your sense of play been so resilient?
Wow, that is a good question, my friend. No one's ever asked me that. Okay, can I ad lib then? Can I just freewheel with that?
Yes, that's what we're here for. So
That's the idea.
absolutely good.
So I'm tearing. This is the sound of me tearing up the script in the background. Okay, so the things that come to that's really. I mean, I think it is worth saying that the sense of play has remained with me through my life, whether I'm in a play or writing a play or being playful. That's not to say, and you can check this with my family, that I'm an incessantly playful person, you know, always full of twinkle in the eye. I'm not. But I think, why do I think this sense of play? Okay, I think, God, that's a good question. I think, first and foremost, light is really useful. Being light, keeping it light, especially at a time when things are quite serious. And I don't think I'm like that in the small hours of the morning, but professionally and socially, I'm quite light. I've just come off a call involved not a head of state, but a very senior person. And very early on, it wasn't exactly cracked a joke, but I said something that other people were thinking, and I said it with maybe it's the British accent. You get away with this stuff, and I'm good at that. And because when you're playful, you can get more done. So I think the sense of lightness, particularly at a time, you know, these are difficult times in many senses. A friend of mine used to say, Ken Campbell used to say, he's a wonderful old actor, used to say, "This is far too important to take seriously," and I think there's something to that. The other thing about play is I trust it. Because the reason I keep playing is because it works for me. And an example of that would be, I don't know if we mentioned, but I run possibly the world's only and definitely the best improvising opera company. So opera friends of mine who can sing pretty well, but we make stuff up on the spot. We make the music and the story and everything up on the spot, like an improv, like a, acted improv.
Yep.
And you can only do that if you play, and by that I mean entertain ideas, give them up, toss them around, amplify, actually be playful and so on and so forth. And if you do that, you get through the show. If you don't, and you're prepared and professional and you've got contingencies and stuff, it dies. So playfulness works. It also works increasingly in the boardroom in that, and this is one of the reasons that I've stayed close to art and the arts, is because I've just been working on a piece, actually creating a play with a colleague called David Glass called Galapagos, which is going to be a play with music for families about the eco-polycrisis and the power of the imagination. But as he says, and I really do agree, the arts don't solve problems, but they help you play problems. And I do think that the tangle that we're in, that we've created, and if you look around, a lot of this is self-created.
Absolutely.
We've got to be compassionate with ourselves. It's partly our minds that do that. I mean, I know how to diet, and I should diet maybe, but I don't. There's this kind of tangle of plus and minus. But the strongest way I've found through these knots is not reasoning your way through, but playing your way through. Being playful. I mean, today I tried something that an artist friend of mine shared with me recently. I'm sitting here in a studio and I've got endless possibilities to practice my singing, to play the piano, to work on yoga, to do my body work, to do my breath work. And I found recently I'm just not doing it because as much as I want to do it, I think if it's going to take 45 minutes to have the time, all this nonsense. Yeah. And she shared with me, she said she does a 5-minute thing, which is she plays a game with herself which says you've only got 5 minutes to practice X, and she puts a timer on. And of course, suddenly you're like, come on, I've got to get on with it. And today already, I've practiced 4 times 5 minutes of something. Now that's not being reasonable with yourself. That's being playful with yourself. And I think that's, for me anyway, it's super helpful. It's the way forward. It's much harder to go about it in a kind of disciplined and, using willpower, but using play power, I find it works for me and many people around me, I think.
Mm. Where that question came from was what you have chosen to name things.
Oh, yeah.
Over the course of your career. I'm like, just wacky names to sum it up under an umbrella, but very playful and descriptive. And I see a through line there. And to me, the older you get, the more serious you get, because these are very important, serious things that we're conducting.
Yes.
And yet you have not. It's been this consistent of fun, playful words.
We said at the beginning, or even before the beginning, that it would be good to have a discovery. That is a little discovery. I hadn't realized until right now that what I'm indulging in a bit is wordplay. I'd never really thought, I'd never put those two things together. So I salute you. Thank you very much. If we look at that, and I'm very touched that you've looked at my oeuvre and not so much irrespective of the content, you're right that I've thought quite a lot about what we call things. And I'm a dad and I love a dad joke, so I love a pun, that's for sure. But at a deeper level, I think, I used to work in advertising, maybe that's part of it, but I do think the names of things are super important, because I think when you name something, or rather when you change the name of something, you change the thing. So let me give you an example of that, where I founded this thing called, or I say I founded it, I think it found me, called Street Wisdom, which is a non-profit which offers free creativity workshops in the streets all over the world. In fact, we're in 90-something countries. And it's difficult to describe what it is. It's a 3-part thing, and it's kind of workshop in the streets. It's a kind of workshop in the streets. And one day I did what I just did there. I mistakenly said the word workshop. And I heard myself say it, and I thought, get it. And basically, when you say the word workshop, it's like using the word wonderful, not wonderful. What I find it does is it fuses a kind of synapse in your head. Often it can make a little laughter because there's a crossover that's unexpected, but it's a new thing you've created. It's one of the reasons I think about workshop. When you say to people, they go, I get it. It's a workshop that you walk in. And it's a kind of, it's a way of taking two things that are separate, like opera and circus, which was my first company, and you snap them together, and people, it causes a frisson, like almost for me, almost like a flavor on the tongue, like, oh, what is that thing? And it's the reason that I very often say to people in businesses, if we want to change things, first change the name of them. And many of your listeners will be familiar with a kind of approach to business workflows called Agile. And it's taken the world by storm. And I think it actually came out of, I think it was GM that originated it. Anyway, whatever. Or maybe it was General Electric. I can't remember. But they have these names for things, a Scrum Master, an Agile, and so on. And because you've refreshed the name, people go, oh, that's a new thing. And it conduct and new behaviors. So for example, I often say to people, we're never going to use the word meeting anymore, because meeting is a generic, pasty gray word that as soon as you call something a meeting, it's dead. No, it's, we're going to call it the ice bath. We're going to call it the detective agency. We're going to, whatever you need to do to shock the brain out of its routine kind of linguistic routines into something new, I think it's helpful. And if anyone on listening in also, I think that's what great questions do. They kind of shock you out of the already always thinking. But also, if you want to change the world, start changing the way you describe the world. I think that's what poets do. I think that's what artists do. I think that's what great communicators do. And as anyone who knows NLP will know Richard Bandler, who invented neurolinguistic programming. And I studied with him, and I remember him saying, you can change the world, or you can change the way you see the world, and one's a lot quicker than the other.
Indeed. Recently had Derek Sivers on the podcast, and he loves just reframing.
Yes.
And using questions to just look at things in a different way, and found that to be very helpful. Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing. I wish I could just remember to do it more often, because I have a torrent of things that kind of come out of my mouth. But and it's why I don't really have the patience. I have a huge respect for coaching community, but I don't have the patience to do it, because that is really about disciplined question asking and a lot of listening, usually with your head on one side. And that I wish I could do it, but I'm too undisciplined, I think.
Well, what I would submit is just keep working on the things that you're working on, because the value you're bringing is amazing. There's a whole bunch of other folks that are great on the coaching front. Let them do that. You keep doing what you're doing.
Okay.
And go all in.
Okay.
Yes. On all fronts on what you're doing. Keep it up.
Would you mind writing that down and sending that to me, and I can show it to people?
Yes, absolutely. I got your back. I got a yellow sticky here, and I will hook you up. Yes.
Thank you, brother.
Yes. So you had mentioned your improvisation work. How does questions inform that?
Wow. Well, the weird paradox in improv is you need quite a strong ego in order to be willing to do it, make stuff up in front of people. But in a peculiar way, the process is quite egoless. Your ego takes a real bashing, because you step into a scene with two other people. And if you decide it's, a dentist's surgery, they will quickly, and you sort of seek to impose that, they will probably they'll gang up on you, and you'll discover you're in a forest somewhere, because it's just part of the game of it. So I think the thing about it is you have to have that questioning, what's going on here, attitude. I've got some ideas, but to attend to the moment. What is this? We often, in impropera, the way we were taught to do it is, there's a situation, and before you sing a word or do anything, you try and sense what is the emotional pulse of this situation. And it's a kind of mysterious thing, but what is the emotional pulse of a woman crying over a child on a beach? And is it different to a woman buying shoes for her son in Oxford Street? And obviously they're different. But there is no set answer to that. But once you collectively engage in what's the pulse, the music seems to emerge. You don't have to stick it on. So I think the question most improvisers are asking, without framing it, and I think it's what makes improv interesting, but also as a performance form, but also as a philosophy, is what's trying to happen here.
Okay.
And if you walk into a scene and go, not what do I want to make happen, which is part of it, but what's trying to happen here? And how can I serve what's happening? When that happens, it's a beautiful sense that there's three of you on stage and two musicians at the side of the stage, but actually there's a sixth individual, which is the situation. There's a sixth force. There's a kind of, and some performance forms, like, I don't know flamenco well, but from what I know of flamenco, they have this notion of duende, which is when it's almost a divine force that is summoned through your performance. And when it appears, it's not the responsibility of the performer. When it comes through, people shout, duende, I see it. And I think that there is the reward for asking the question, what's trying to happen here, is when it happens, people see it. People see you doing it, people serving the moment. And it's a question I often take into boardrooms, where people have been rewarded and encouraged to say, what do I want to make happen? What are we going to make happen? Not an invalid question. But if you can ask, what's trying to happen here? What is the market? Is the market toast or is the market sleeping? And how can we serve that? What's trying to happen is a really interesting question. I've seen it unlock situations where people couldn't figure out what they should do because they started thinking, how can I be the facilitator? How can I be the means by which this thing can happen? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I'm getting all these images just coming at me, and it's really stepping into the flow of what's happening versus being the one to say, I must build this thing. And the imagery that comes to mind is more like building a brick wall, this hard thing, versus birthing and getting into that flow and saying, this is what is appropriate for this time. This is what's happening with a greater context. So this is what we are seeking to bring. Those are two completely different energies.
And I think we need the second more than ever because, and perhaps helpfully, that the world doesn't really stay still long enough for the bridge builder. We're going to do that thing there.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's an image that comes to mind, and I'm not Chinese and I can't validate this, but my understanding is that there's ancient Chinese proverb or whatever it is, but that, the way to cross a river that you don't know is take your shoes and socks off and feel your way across the stones. And why I think that's really beautiful is, as opposed to an engineering exercise where you lay your reality on top of this unknown thing. You just say, we're going to go over it.
Mm-hmm.
But feeling your way, in the alternative is you take your shoes and socks off so you can feel. You then put your feet into an unknown medium, which has its risks. And then by trial and error, you quest, if you like. You ask questions of the earth. You play with gravity, and you find your way across the stones. And I think that finding your way across the stones isn't what's taught in school, but needs to be. And we're sort of doing a bit of that in later life. And I think it will reward, I think these times will reward more of that. You've got to be purposeful for sure, but finding your way across the stones and taking action, moving forward or sideways. I like this idea of quest, and we use it in Street Wisdom. I mentioned Street Wisdom, the workshop, the middle section. So the first section is a short tune-up or a tune-in, which is awakening your senses, again, to what's trying to happen possibly. But by the way, one of the reasons Street Wisdom's gone far and wide is because there's very little technical or soft language in it. It's a very simple set of instructions, and I took a long time to get it down to something that is really not at all woo-woo, if you like, and it's just very simple. If you do this, and that's no disrespect to woo-woo, I love it. It's good. I think woo-woo is the reality. But the second part is a quest. Once you've tuned in, you ask a question, and what happens there is that, and the reason I put that in is because having done quite a lot of mindfulness and other practices, I'd sort of noticed that once you connect with the system around you, if you want to play with it, as you said, ask it a question. And another way of saying that is step into a system with intention and the system responds. Yeah. If you just step into a system as a bystander, nothing much happens. But if you tune out senses, you're in a public street and you go, here's a question for my life. What happens time and time and time again, and not just with lunatics like me, but across the world with thousands and thousands of people, not always, but that's been over 10 years, that's been the thing, is that the environment interacts with you. It sends things back to you because you're in an intentional relationship with your surroundings. You're being playful with the world around you. And it's amazing what comes back. Now, does it come back or does it come from you? We could have an argument about the metaphysics of that. They're both true, I think, in some senses. All that happens when you look out at the street in the way I'm talking is you sense consciously what's in your unconscious. And so therefore you're generating the whole thing. We could have a conversation about that, but it's back to this idea, the quest, the openness, and say, look, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to go where my feet take me, which is a bit like walking across the river, feeling your way across the stones. For people that spend a lot of their time in a very rational, A to B, linear, let's get this done, let's get it done quicker, let's move on to the next thing.
Right.
To step out of their offices, step into the street with this open-minded question, what they often say is they wander and they get lost and find answers, if that makes sense. Rather than deciding where we're going, they get there as quickly as possible. And that idea of wandering, which is at the heart of Street Wisdom, it's the heart of Wonderful, the book and the podcast, is something I've been discovering and I'm still discovering, which is the power of, you know, there's this old English word to err, E-R-R, to err, which if you look at it, errare, its rooted errare in Latin means to wander off course. And we were told as a kid that if you wander off course, it's an error and you're going to get an X and you lose that point. What people are beginning to have to learn in later life is that if you don't wander, the right answer you get is going to be very short-lived. So I'm not a very good pilot, but I've qualified in the past as a pilot. I'm not current still. I need to get back on board. But basically what I learned there is, there's a map. There's a beginning and end point, and you plot your course. And from the second you get in the plane, you're off course because the wind is blowing you. So you're constantly having to adjust and tack, and essentially your path is wibbly wobbly. And I think that what's happened in the last few years, people have kind of like gone, wow, the world seems to have changed. I think a client summed it up really well. I was working at a bank, and his people were saying to him, we miss the control that we used to have in the past. He said, no, you missed the illusion of control that you had in the past. I think you probably feel the same, that the world we live in is much more in flux than we were led to believe. And therefore it's in flux. You want to be very questing. You want to be testing the stones. I'd rather follow a leader, if I need to follow a leader, I'd rather follow a leader that's going, I'm 90% off course, but I'm 100% sensitive to what the feedback I'm getting from the world, rather than somebody that says, follow me, it's this way, and I've got the map.
Yeah, certainly the pandemic and such threw everything for a loop and caused us to question what we thought was firm. Earlier this week, I did 2 street wisdom walks, and I've had my own experience walking. And so I was like, let me also give this a go. And I used the app that was freely available out there to walk through, or no pun intended, but to go through those phases that you've got to get to that quest. All of it's super easy. It's not woo-woo. And I enjoyed the walk. The first night was Monday, and I actually did it late at night. I've got a sleep system on the bed and got amazing sleep. Just by virtue of being out, all my sleep numbers were better as a result. So I'm like, that's a good thing. And while I had a question, or the question that I was thinking about was regarding the podcast, but we just had a tree taken down in our front yard, and my wife and I have been mulling over what tree to replace it with. So while I was thinking that my question was about the podcast, what I kept coming back to was looking at all of the trees and evaluating them and thinking about how they would be in our front yard. And so while I was off on this pursuit, and I thought that it was primarily about this one thing, what tree are we going to put in our yard? This is what's been on my mind. And then the second night when I went out for the walk, it was a similar kind of a thing. So to me, it was probably the question that was most heavily on my head was this thing about trees, not so much what I was trying to push back. So as we loop back to the flow versus the bridge that we're building, I was busy trying to put down a bridge saying, this is the primary thing that I need to think on. And internally in the flow was like, no, this other thing, this is the feeling the rocks and figuring out this answer to what tree you're going to have in your front yard for the next couple decades. That's really what's weighing most heavily on your mind right now.
I hear you, brother. I mean, it's so interesting you say that, because sometimes what happens in street wisdom is that what people come back with is the question. They don't come back with an answer, but they come back with the question that they actually want to ask, which is, I think, as valuable as coming back with it. And we often, by the way, don't say the answer. We say fresh answers, because there's lots of options. So there's that. Finding the question that you want to ask is useful in itself, because ask the wrong question, you'll get an answer you don't really need. But I think there's also something else in what you're saying, which is distraction sounds like a bad thing. And I don't know if it's just my mind or something, but in putting street wisdom together, I thought, rather than still the wandering mind, let's release the wandering mind and follow it where it wanders. Because I think that is creativity in a way. And trusting that the wandering isn't wasting time. There are all of these words, when I was writing Wonderful, there are all of these pejorative words that relate to wandering. Vagrancy, which means to, vagare means to wander. Vagrancy is a crime, for goodness sake.
Right.
You know, dilly-dally, shilly-shallying, all of these things. Because the Victorians, I guess, really indexed on, let's get that bridge built. And there were, perhaps that was the spirit of the times. And so not being A to B as quickly as possible looks inefficient, looks like indolence, looks like stupidity. But actually, I think it's the wandering mind that has the real answers for us now. They're non-obvious, they're non-linear. At least that's my observation. And you also bring back to mind a woman, this idea of one question that's got another question underneath it. So there was a woman that sticks in my mind. She's actually a friend of my sister's, and I was doing a local one. And the lady turned up and explained the rules. This was many years ago. And I said, so what's your question? Because there's a moment before the quest where you ask people to bring a question to mind. And we just encourage them not to be too big, like, why am I here? Or too small, like, too trivial. But it should be about you. It's about you. It's very much about the first person. And she said, my question is, what's the oldest building in the street? I said, great. But that's not really the rule. It's not really a third. But no, she said, no, that's what it is. I said, well, enjoy. Fine. Off you go. So she went out and she asked that question. When she came back, she had a funny smile on her face and said, when we do the sharing, which is part 3, it's very often just, many, many people find that their question morphs. And she said, yeah, I went out to ask that question, but I came back with a different question. I realized the question I wanted to ask was, what will I do when my kids leave home? Because it was about her age. She was thinking about age, and her brain said, well, ask a nice, safe question about age of buildings. But actually what she discovered was she wanted to ask is, what shall I do? Am I a piece of history? And I think that's beautiful. But you don't get there by schooling the mind. I think you get there by following the wandering mind and using the question. Another way to think about it, which I love, and it came to me recently, I suddenly thought, the thing about creativity, the way to activate your creativity is to throw a large stick. In other words, it's like a puppy. And if you want to excite your creativity, throw it a large stick away and watch it scamper to come back and see what it does. And I think that's a lot of what I'm doing now at this stage of my life. In a way, I'm going, let's throw this stick and see what happens. So again, back to your playfulness, I think that's very interesting. I can't remember the scientist that said this, but was it Irving Toffler or someone? I can't quite remember, but they said creativity is a unique phenomenon where the teacher and the pupil reside in the same body. Creativity is that unique phenomenon where teacher and the pupil reside in the same body, which I think is such an interesting way of thinking about it, which is your creativity has plans that you know nothing about, but you need to release it. And a way of doing that is, as I said, throw it last, or ask a good big question. I was in a meeting, and you'll know this, but I was in a meeting I was in Milan a few months ago. And I was with a group of people, business people, who ask, they're always asking questions, but the questions tend to be what, when, how much, what's the profit, what's the downside? All good questions, right?
Yeah.
And I said, you know what? We need to move from sort of execution to design. And one of the things about design, if you still want to design thing, you have to ask slightly different questions like, why not? What if? What then? Why not us? And I use this as an example. There's an inventor, I'm going to say 60s, I may be wrong, his young daughter, and they were at a theme park and stuff, and he took a picture of her, and she said, Daddy, why do we have to wait for the pictures? Because in those days, you had to send the film off.
Absolutely.
And he was the guy that invented the Polaroid, because his daughter said, well, and he thought, that is a good question. Why do we have to wait for and it was that, I think with businesses and organizations, they need to be asking those kind of questions to get to new places, and not just the operational, how much, what if, what then questions. Anyway.
But ties back to what we were talking about a little bit ago regarding the flow and the birthing of what is next? What is this supposed to be? What is required? That question that resulted in Polaroid and billions of dollars, that was a necessary progression, or a quote logical, now that we look back on it, to say this is what was needed. Edison and Tesla were neck and neck on who's going to invent electricity, or not invent, but discover, I guess. They're not quite that powerful, but it's almost like the time has come. Yeah. And so if we're an organization, if in managing my life, what is this thing that is next?
Yeah.
How can we foster that, design that, free that to be able to come? To your point, now throw the big stick. Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, I find that fascinating, because he didn't have to listen. She'd asked many other questions that day, but there's something about that question, and then sticking with it, throwing the large stick and following it. I mean, really, really interesting. What are questions are we being asked that we missed today, you and me, I found a question, it's all coming in. I didn't realize there were all these questions, but I've recently done a project which we called Future School, and it was really successful, and it's looking like it's really going to grow. But basically, it emerged from the following question. And it's, what would your grandchildren's children thank you for learning today? And that's one of those what's trying to happen here questions, because we won't know. But can you feel into the future and look back and imagine not what you think you should learn, but what will the future thank you for learning? And the reason we use the word thank you is because another big question, which doesn't get asked, is, what if this worked out? What if this worked out? I think so much of politics and social discourse and everything is predicated on the assumption this is not going to work out.
Right.
And it's everywhere, right? But it was interesting. I did a workshop in this very room a few weeks ago, including my daughter, for younger people. And I asked the question, raise your hand if you can, or who here can see the world getting better in any way ever in the future? And not a single young person put up their hand.
Wow.
And that really it rocked me, and it alarmed me as well, but it also made me think, you know what? We need to exercise imagination, because you need to be asking the question, well, what if this did work out? What if this was better than we could imagine? Because there are lots of people, believe me, I've kept up with the literature, a lot of people looking to the future, pretty optimistic. But it is interesting to me that if it's true that most people are thinking this doesn't work out, how is that affecting our decision-making? How's it affecting our choices? mine as well. So I think it's a really interesting question to ask is what if this worked out better than we could imagine? And you see people go, yeah, but. And I say, okay, close your eyes. Let's go. And using hypnosis or whatever techniques. If you go to the future and you just give people permission to see it working out better than we could imagine. Because remember, we are living in a future that our grandparents couldn't imagine working out, right? And we're here.
Right.
Yeah. But it's amazing, even if you just use that muscle a bit, and then you come back to the so-called present and go, okay, now what was the problem again? It's different. I'm not saying it's better, and I'm not being Pollyanna about it, but I do think it's a great question. What if this worked out?
A friend of mine had used a variation on that where he's like, we're locked in by a failure of imagination. This dismal outlook that we have, it's not necessarily in concrete that it's going to happen. It's a failure of imagination for us to not see that something is beautiful around the corner.
100%. And it's even as I sit there, I can feel the kind of the electricity in that, and the frisson in that. And I said to one of the young people, I said, is one of the reasons you don't want to see it working out, is if you could see it working out, do you think your friends would have issues with you? And they went, oh yeah. If I was to sit as a young person and say, I think this is going to work out, it would look irresponsible. It would look like I'm an idiot. I'm a naive person. How can I substantiate that? It was like I'm endorsing the current status quo. So I think it's really interesting that it has become that the kind of the no hope has become really embedded in some ways. And as I like to quote, there's a guy, Jeff Mulligan, who wrote a book, Another World is Possible. And to oversimplify his message, it's if you imagine the kind of futures we want, there's no guarantee they're going to happen. But if you don't imagine them, it's guaranteed they won't. And if we think of imagination as I often describe as the ability to see what isn't there, which is kind of it. It's like I can imagine a cup of coffee, but I need to imagine it before I can go and make it. But it's, as far as we know, most animals don't do very much of that. They deal with what is. A squirrel looks at a nut tree and goes, are there nuts there? A human looks at the nut tree and goes, if I chop that down, I could probably build a house that my grandkids could live in. And also a Nutella farm, blah, blah. We have that ability to see beyond what's there, and it can be helpful and it can be not helpful. But one of the questions back, I'm mindful of your quest, which is about questions. And it's one of the questions that I think runs underneath street wisdom. And it also definitely is in improv, and it's in theater, and I think it's in learning, is the question, what is that? And the reason you ask that question, and there are different exercises you can do, is that if you look out and you look across the room and there's a printer, as there is here, and I go, what is that? And I go, that's a printer. But if you now imagine you're from Mars and you've arrived here, and you're a traveler in these, and you go, what is that? And if you try and see it for the first time, and there are different ways of doing that, like if you name it something different, it loosens all of these objects and all of these conventions are suddenly loosened from routine. They unstick from reality and they're playable with. And I think that's probably what's behind this question. Really? Really? And I think we need more of that in a way, because it's true. You need conventions. You need things to stay where they are. You don't want printers floating around the air that could be this, it could be that. You don't want somebody flying a plane to say, I don't know, what happens if I, let go of my hands? And instead poetry is like, no, do the thing that you're trained to do. That said, I believe that what happens as a kid is that when you learn the name of something, you stop looking at it properly. So before you know a chair is a chair, it's this. It can be anything, right? As soon as you know it's a kitchen chair and it belongs in the kitchen, it's no longer your plaything. It's a chair. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. So busy reaching for a book that's always in my backpack here. Get here. There you go. Awareness by Anthony DeMello.
Oh, somebody mentioned this to me. I've never read it. Tell me.
This is a must read for you.
Okay.
And he actually brings up this naming thing exactly because he mentions that if you tell a child, if a child sees this little thing with feathers flipping around and says, "What is that?" and the parent says, "Well, that's a sparrow." Now the child sees every other sparrow and says, "That's a sparrow," so it's not interesting. But by virtue of suspending the name, now we talked earlier about the importance of naming, which is true. So all of these things have their place.
Yeah.
Whereby if you don't name it, then each one of those little flitting balls of feathers is an individual, and there's a curiosity about that.
Beautiful.
So
beautiful.
that's, I have to, or I intentionally do that with people, because otherwise it's so easy for me, especially if you talk politics or, anything that we can divide ourselves with. I have to intentionally say, I'm refusing to put the label on because this person is an individual, and therefore I need to inquire, I need to learn and appreciate them for the person, for the individual that they are. And you will absolutely love this book.
Beautiful.
On many levels. And I highly encourage it.
You're the second
everyone.
person to mention it. Again, what's trying to happen here. I now view that as kind of, it's not a coincidence. It's it's time for that to happen. And therefore I can serve the moment by doing that. It's not about me, not about you, but it's okay, good. And you've reminded me of something that happened, and you've helped me understand it actually. I've spent more time in the green stuff, what they call nature, although we are all nature, right? But I found myself compelled after the pandemic to go, and I wanted to go to the snow. I had to go to the snow. I don't know why, but I had to go to the snow. And so I took a camper van and I went off with a friend of mine, or I went off by myself, and then I met up with a friend of mine who's very involved in the eco world, and we went off to the snow. And we'd spent 2 or 3 days in the Abruzzo, which is just outside Rome, in the snow, and we met the wolves, and amazing. And as part of that immersion in nature, I remember this moment where I was standing, in a way it's such a small moment, in a way it's a huge moment. I was standing looking out over a valley, and a bird flew past, just like you just explained with the sparrow. A bird flew past, and I was watching the bird, and suddenly I realized it wasn't a bird, it was that bird. That happened in my head, and it went, no, it's that. That's the only bird. I don't know what its name is, but that's the only bird that is in that space of time at the moment doing that thing. And it stopped being generic and it became specific and particular. And my body lit up. It was like, oh my God, it's not a bird, it's that bird. Do you know what I mean?
I do. Yes.
Really, really. And because as you connect with that bird, you get this shock of, what do you want to call it? The divine? I don't know what it is, but a kind of, we call it in Galapagos, we call it the imaginatus. It's a made-up word for the imaginative essence of creation, which other people might call the force or the whatever. But I'm really curious about what that is and how I can have more of it.
Yes.
It's really what street wisdom is about, actually, because the reason we deliberately set it in the city and in the daily and the humdrum is it's not inconceivable that you go to a strange place, a beautiful rural setting, and you see an eagle and you feel something. But can you, on the 13 bus, on a cold, wet November, surrounded by screaming children or whatever it is, can you sense the same wonder? Can you sense the specificness of the moment? Can you savor being alive, the presence, all that kind of stuff? And that's, I think, where the work, at least feels to me, where my work needs to be, which is in the kind of, the subtitle of Wonderful is Find the Wonder in the Everyday, every day. And I don't know why I'm drawn to it. And I think these books are written for me, not by me, to be honest. But I think there's something in that.
I think that the ability, or that's where I'm at now, is we have talked about a lot of glorious things, and it's how to foster that and to make it accessible. So, like, you've got street wisdom as a mechanism to do that. Yeah, just wanting to make that repeatable such that I can encounter that world, or I want to encounter that magic more. Figuring out mechanisms or such that I can click into it or put myself in the circumstance where I can encounter that sense of magic and joy in the everyday. Life is just going to be so much more full. In a project that I did in 2018, that was my hashtag year of connection. And I decided at the end of 2017, I was going to intentionally have conversations with people. So then it became, over 2018, I had 150 conversations that lasted from 20 minutes to like 3 hours. But I was looking for people to have a conversation with. And
Interesting.
that was so meaningful to me. Some of those folks are dear friends to me, and they've had significant impact on my life. And then I did this walk through DC over 2 years, and once again met incredible people. But it was also the built environment. I was systematically walking through the streets because I was trying to walk every street and alley in DC. So it's less wandering per se. But it was, once again, it was recognizing the built environment as well as trying to connect with people, because it was predominantly about social justice is what I was doing. But it was being absolutely wide open, and posture as I was walking was intentionally head up, shoulders back, looking at the eyes of every person that I walked by, because if I was going to have a conversation or not. And just that being open, I think, led to so many more interactions, and just that physical posture of what is out there and looking for opportunities for serendipity and making myself available to it. Those were remarkable times. There was an act of putting myself in these circumstances such that I could encounter that magic. And I learned a few podcast episodes ago where a bunch of that came from. It all pretty much saved my life and pulled me out of a really dark spot. Therefore, this is my sustenance to keep going and finding these moments of magic and these points of connection. And if I stop doing that, I'm not going to be in a good place. I'm not going to be in a healthy place.
Wow. I mean, I want to say first and foremost, I salute you, brother. I know your work. I realize now
Mm.
that you're the man that walked. You walked Washington. I've heard. I mean, I've heard of that act. And I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you what initiated it. And before I do, maybe your listeners have already heard. So I'm just really curious. But also, I wanted to say that in response to your openness, I also have had real dark times. As a kid, as a youngster, I was in and out of hospital, a psychiatric hospital, and often people come to me and they say, I'm feeling suicidal. I go, well, no, I'm not surprised. Anyone that's sensitive in a world like this, you feel a lot, you're going to feel. But I think also the gift of that darkness is that I recognize I sort of need practices, and we all do, practices that can help us develop these muscles over time, develop this awareness, as you say, get into that place quicker. But also, in some ways, I don't think I would have appreciated the magic without the experiencing the opposite, the complete absence of what felt like possibility and stuff. But that's me. I just amazing that you did that. Is there anything you can tell me about what What precipitated you out into the streets, shoulders down, head held high?
It was really the understanding. All right, so this will be fun to say it this way. It's because I spent most of my life not saying, really?
Me too.
Because it was only within the last 8 years or so that I started saying, really? A lot. And it has upended pretty much all of my identities. Because for the first 4.5 decades of my life, it was listen to the structures and the things that are in place because we say that this is reality. And then I started talking to people through the conversations and finding out that their experiences was radically different than mine. And so me walking through the world as now a middle-aged white dude in America, cisgendered, right? This country is built for me.
Yeah.
And so any variation from that standard or perceived or stated standard is harder in some capacity. And through all of these formative years, I've been told, love your neighbor. I need to sacrifice because of being military time. So there was all of these things that I learned and became a part of me. And then when I found out that that is not the lived experience for my neighbors, the rose-colored glasses are broken. Therefore, I need to do something. I need to communicate that our current state is wrong and change is required. So let's go have conversations. And I recognize that it's most likely through conversations that change can happen, or being asked, really? I started walking the Sunday after George Floyd was murdered.
Wow.
And I had a big sandwich board front and back that said Black and Brown Lives Matter. And so that's what I carried. And it took me 102 weeks, 101 weeks of walking through every street and alley in DC. And it started out predominantly to encourage the Black and Brown community. If those that I passed in those communities, if they're encouraged by it, great, but this was not a forcing thing. And then to have the challenging conversations with the white community, which I have data to say that white people don't want to talk about race in America. And Raymond Coates was a guy that I met along the way. He kept pressuring me, and I loved it. He kept pressuring me. He's like, but what's in this for you? I had those first two answers, but he's like, no. What is in this for you? And what I concluded was that this is me trying to get all of this learning to chalk it up in a concise term, white supremacy, to get that out of my system and to purge. And part of that process was doing this walk and having these conversations and having people tell me about their experience and not try to gaslight them and tell them that they misunderstand. And most of it was an affront to my ego and my identities that I've lived with. It was an absolutely remarkable journey. I mean, I'm so grateful for those folks that were willing to, like, one example was, had come up to a group of folks, and they're all Black Americans, and they're sitting outside in front of the place, all just talking, having a great afternoon. And one woman, maybe about my age, she came up, she was in my face, and she was like, "Are you a racist?" And her friends were like, "What kind of question is that? He's carrying this sign." And she's like, "That doesn't mean anything to me." She's like, "What is this actually going to accomplish? What change are you going to bring?" And I don't have any snappy answers. And I'm so grateful for her willingness to challenge me and not just accept it at face value, but to really hold me to account and to say, what are you going to do differently? How are you going to bring about change? Because I've lived it over here. So I'm not going to get that honest engagement. It was, like I said, it was a huge kindness that this woman expressed her frustration and was just not going to take things at face value. So grateful. So grateful.
It's beautiful. I mean, double beauty. I think it's incredible. You hold it lightly, but doing it one day is one thing, but doing it assiduously again and again I really salute you for doing that. No, not to big you up, but I just think that's you listening to the big stick in you.
Yes.
And also, she asked you a great question. What are you going to do? And what are you doing? And to be able to not have a snappy answer, but to sit in that. One of the things that we haven't really spoken about is questions that don't have answers. And I think the thing about the arts is it's much more tolerant of asking questions that don't have answers. They're not meant to have answers. They're meant for you to roll them around your mind and your mouth and your soul and go, I love the fact you didn't have a smart answer, but you're still, in some ways, maybe you're still processing that. And asking those, do you know what I mean? In businesses, they're like, well, if you're asking a question that doesn't have an answer, you're wasting your time. In the arts, if you're asking a question that does have an answer, you're probably wasting your time. You know what I mean? I often tease people and said, to be or not to be, and I'm talking to accountants or to strategists or whatever, just so you know, that isn't supposed to be answered. It's not, get KPMG or McKinsey in and say, do a statistical analysis and tell us, is to be better than not to be? That's not what it's about. It's sitting in the middle of an unanswerable question to enrich your humanity. Sitting in the agony of that unanswerable question is the point. And this is my concern about AI and whatever. And there are good things and bad things, no doubt. But outsourcing the debate and just saying that quick, ChatGPT, get me to the end point as quickly as possible because I'm uncomfortable with the not knowing, is a real misunderstanding about the value of the input versus the value of the output. Because people think the important thing is to get the answer. It isn't. The important thing is to find your way through the questioning, in my view. Now, of course, there are some really helpful things about it, but I had a guy telling me the other day trying to convince me that his daughter writing a Shakespeare sonnet on ChatGPT was as valid as her writing a poem without ChatGPT. And I said, look, we could have an argument about the relative merits, but I will not ever accept that they're the same. They're not the same. Yeah, but they are, because the end justifies the means. As long as it's like the point, we don't need another sonnet in the world, but we need a child that can write a sonnet. No, and that's where I think we're in a really, and I think this is why this podcast is really good, which is asking difficult questions that may not have an answer is what we're for. It isn't, what would Hamlet have done? So you get an answer in Act 3 or Act 2, whenever he says, a sign comes down and says, we've done an audience survey, the answer is to be. You can go home now. It's like, that's not the point. The point is, these dilemmas that we face, we need to be richer humans in order to find our way through the dilemmas. But it's not a Google Maps thing. You've got to get lost, I feel, in order to, and waste time. Because it's the looking, not the answer. That's what's important.
To your point, that's what we do bring as humans.
Yeah. And I think we're in the minority. I think there might be people listening to this going, they're idiots. But I salute you. We don't know each other. But again, I think it is important what you're doing. And I found with a podcast as well, it's a beautiful way of it's like birds sending a call out, and folk of a similar feather can hear it. Because I think in some ways, I mean, there's a bit of a riff, but my observation about that, if we were going to call it this, the progressive movement, whatever that means, the cultural creatives, the whatever, is that we are, part of our blindness is we think we're the only ones. I've got my podcast, you've got your podcast, you're doing a thing, a question. But in fact, if you zoom out, I think it's a massive movement, and it's lateral, it's across the world, with people kind of interested in the work that you're doing, maybe the work that I'm doing as well. And we don't necessarily connect up. So another great question to ask is, where are my people? I'm writing these down because I hadn't realized there are these questions, but these are fantastic questions to ask. But I think that's what happens. I don't know if you feel the same, but I feel like with something like Street Wisdom, it's a beacon where people go, maybe that's my people. And it's not to be exclusive, but I think communities of interest where we have similar, finding people that see the world so you don't think you're nuts and alone is really important.
Yeah, very much so. I started this first with the website and then over with the podcast. I keep hearing all these podcasts out there are about asking people the questions, but nobody's turning it on the meta task or meta skill of questions. There's a lot of amazing books out there, or I shouldn't even say a lot. There's several amazing books about asking questions, but it's still a niche market. And in this world of AI, where now you can quickly get an answer to anything. So it really is critical to ask better questions and to formulate the questions, which is the AI prompting. So that's just another way of saying questions. To me, this is a massive opportunity for people to grow this skill, or first recognize that it is a skill. So that means that it can be developed and you can continually get better. So let's build this ecosystem, and as folks connect, then let's play in this world of questions and just enjoy it, because the humanity is what we bring to the table. AI can take care of the rest.
Love it. I was thinking this morning about AI and about when I was a kid, many is the evening I had aching arms because my father, as I said, was this polymath, loved encyclopedias and dictionaries. And there used to be a kind of little continuous circuit of children being sent upstairs. Go and get D to F. What does that word mean? And we're up and we're down and stuff like that. And in order to settle some dispute or some debate. And it occurred to me that ChatGPT, I mean Google, but then also ChatGPT you can do it in a flash and get the answer. But it removes, you've outsourced the need to debate things in some ways. Now, it's not always true. But my question is, what are you going to do with the time you save? Okay, you got there quicker. And now what? And I think that's going to be the puzzling thing when people go, oh yeah, it's super convenient. And there's 10,000 people less that we employ. And even the wealthy people, so we made more money. But now I've seen the wealth. I've seen very wealthy people. And I've seen that look in their eye, which goes, what do I do now? People misunderstand. I think people have businesses as an excuse to have relationships. It's not, yes, it's about X, Y, and Z. But I often feel like if we were on a desert island, you and I, we spend the first day kind of orienting, and then we might write a poem or two. And then you'd look around and you realize you've got coconuts, and I'd realize I've got pampas grass, and I'd say, hey, do you want to swap a couple of them? Because you need to have, and it's a means of exchange, and it's a way of having relationships.
Right. Yeah.
And I think this desire to abolish inconvenience and to speed to the answer is misunderstanding what we're here for.
I think the necessity to survive and make money, to have shelter and the rest, sucks the primary energy out of anything and everything. And so there's less opportunity, or people have to be very intentional about how they are going to expend their attention. That is the currency, is attention. So yes, at the end of the day, are you willing to wrestle with the questions or just turn on the TV and have the entertainment spoon fed to you?
Sure.
Everybody's going to make their own decision on rewards of doing a hard day's work.
I'm scribbling down another question, which is, it's great to have questions as a framework, but one I've been asking, building on what you just said, is there's a sense of system. We're coming to the end of a sort of system. What does Joanna Macy call it? I think the great unwinding. There's a sense of something's coming to an end, and the great turning hasn't quite happened yet, and we're in between. But I found myself asking, imagine if you could wave a wand and achieve all the climate goals and the biodiversity goals, and you could sort of reset. Imagine a magical thing where tomorrow we reset and we get back to even a pristine state. How long would it be before humanity began to make the same mistakes, to start to defray that system? The answer is it would be instantaneous unless we change something else. And we know that, right? But it's like, of course you've got to concentrate on the extrinsics, but it's, to your point, I think about, if you were to remove the kind of annoying practicalities of making a living and earning the money and so on and so forth, and I feel this as well, the times when and this is one, when I've managed to create a little bit of ease, I've organized my life a little bit so that I have been working, but I'm not working super hard right the second we're having this call, and I've got a sense of ease. Part of me is kind of like drumming its fingers going, hang on, you don't earn that, come on, get to work, get to visible, all those buckets. So it's so deep in us that your self-worth is linked to doing these slightly humdrum things at times, but also not that my work is humdrum. In case any clients listening, it's not. But it's it's work. Of course, it is work. But I also notice in myself a fear of the unstructured, open time. That in some ways, the underlying fable of our times is, with wealth you earn ease, and ease is something you want. And I don't think that's true. I think most people are terrified of ease. Not the first day or the second day, but 3 weeks into the ease, you'll be throwing big sticks. That's why super wealthy people, I think, continue to want to, get the best interest rates and invest in new projects. It's the coconut and pampas grass thing. It's like, we're here to play, back to your point. I think we're in a minority, and I've been in in places I should never be. I'm in and out of boardrooms and governments and so on and so forth. And I feel like if they knew what was in my head and the questions I was asking, I don't think it's like, that is a total moment of really? And honestly, not with any arrogance, because I often feel like, no, they must be right. But I remember a finance minister saying to me, they were talking about figures, and there were some figures that come up that someone was annoyed with. And this guy said, listen, just remember that all figures are either looked up or made up. And those that are looked up are made up. In other words, even in this world of data, of ones and digits and so on and so forth, there's a fiction at work. It isn't real, it's a fiction. So one of my pleas is when I do a lot of work teaching story technique and so on and so forth, is like, we don't need more lying in the world. We need more truth telling, but let's use the techniques of storytelling to make sure it gets heard. And that's really part of my mission, I think, as well, which is right back to what we said before. How do we name this differently? How do we name things playfully so that we can share? And this is whether they like, maybe people don't want it, but I feel there's gold in what you're talking about. And I hope there is in what I'm been exploring, and always puzzling to think of how can I make this more accessible, more available, more delightful? How can people learn more without realizing they're learning? How can we teach without lecturing? Da-di-da-di-da. And it's really interesting. There's a lot to play with.
Indeed. To be respectful of your time, because I would really like to just keep going for a long time.
Likewise.
Yes. Any other thoughts or encouragements about questions that we haven't necessarily intentionally explored that come to mind?
I suppose there's one sidebar, which you referenced it, but one of the things that we've discovered in Street Wisdom is ask strangers your questions. And that sounds weird. Well, it won't for you, but I've had extraordinary experiences, and I've seen it happen innumerable times, that when you're tuned in and you're in that certain kind of shoulders back openness thing, if you ask a question that you feel you have to figure out, but you ask a stranger, you'll be sometimes amazed at what comes back. And also how often that person is the right person to ask. So often I say, answers are everywhere, and so are teachers. And I think democratizing, as you said, democratizing the learning, it's everywhere. And if someone walked up to me and asked me a question that was meaningful for their life, I think I'd share it. One thing comes to mind was an example. I was working with a group of Palestinians and Israeli students in London. They come to London a while back to develop their discourse. And one of them was was actually sort of head of PR for the Palestinian Authority. She was a young woman, but she was basically thinking about the PR of Palestine. And this was before, of course, all the current conflict blew up. But if the conflict was there under the surface. And we were standing in, I'm going to say Leicester Square, and we did a Street Wisdom, and she walked off. She came back kind of like looking shocked. The first person stranger she'd spoken to was a guy who was trying to sell her a place on one of these tourist buses. I don't know if you have them in the States, but
Yeah.
and he said to her, "Can I talk to you?" And she said, "You can talk to me if I can talk to you." And he was like, Anyway, he's a Londoner. He asked her, do you want to do this? She said, "Not right now, but let me ask you my question. How should Palestine represent itself better to the world?" Turns out this guy was an avid Middle East watcher and a great thinker about Palestine. He's a young guy. What are the chances? And he gave her some absolutely drop-dead brilliant answers. And that, just as an idea that comes to mind, is like, share your questions. They're not as yours as you think they are. And one of my visions and dreams is that there'll be streets in cities called the Wisdom Street, where people go and they fully expect to be asked life questions, and they're fully open to offering whatever they've got to offer. How great would that be?
That would be beautiful. Yeah, that would be remarkable. And right along those lines, one of the things that I very much hold dear to me regarding this whole questions idea is that it comes back to democratizing questions, is that good questions can come from anywhere and everywhere.
Beautiful, yeah.
It's not only the person that's up there in the C-suite in some company, just as this woman had encountered this guy selling the bus tickets. It's this insight and this wisdom. It cuts across all of time. It cuts across socioeconomic. It cuts across political. It cuts across all of these dividing lines or segments, identities, whatever it is. Good questions can just come through and serve.
Totally. You brought one to mind, which is back to my CEO that I spoke to before, the guy I was working with. They'd just done an IPO very successfully. And I said, so how are you feeling? He said, well, I'm very pleased about it, but I have a nightmare. I said, what's the nightmare? He said, my nightmare is that we do the wrong work well. And people don't ask that question often enough, which is, we're working hard, but is it the right work? Do you know what I mean? There's a great question.
Yes, I got some questions on the site about metrics. And are the metrics that you're using the right metrics? Do they matter at all? What kind of behavior are they driving? Unintentional? Yeah.
Are we doing the wrong work well? It's a great question. Even if you don't know the answer, it's a great question. And the other thing I wanted to say, if anyone's been listening to this and is thinking, that street wisdom thing sounds interesting, it'd be great if you could maybe share how people can get to us. I'm sure you will anyway. But also, thank you for taking a dabbling with street wisdom, playing with it. It's super easy to do, as you said. You can download the audio. But if you want to do it with other people, there's a thing we do every year, which is on this year, 2024, is on the 27th of September, called the Worldwide Wonder, where there are people all over the world who either have done street wisdom or want to have a taste of it. And for them, we do a kind of walk across the world. We tend to start in Australia and we end in like Brazil, and we do it over a 12-hour period. And it's a wonderful experience of flocking together. People can do it on their mobiles. They can do it wherever they want. They don't have to be in a certain place. But this sort of sense of we're apart but together, I think is, again, letting technology facilitate that the way you and I are doing now, where we're thousands of miles apart, but it's like we're in the same room together. And I think that is a miraculous thing that we should be using more. A quest that starts in Australia and unwinds follows the sun across the world, and we ask questions, usually based on the idea of like, you ask whatever question you want, but it's like, what's next? That such human question, which you'll never get an answer to because we don't know the future, but what's next? What's next? What can we make happen next? Where am I heading? Where next? So if anyone wants to play, they're super, super welcome. It's free. And you find the details on theworldwidewonder.com.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. I will be signing up and talking with Lynn Borton that I had on here earlier. And so I'll be doing that in Arlington, Virginia, when the time comes. For listeners, I highly encourage, please do check out this Worldwide Wander on the 27th of September. So as this is released, should be right in time for you to get that on your calendar, block the date, and then also just tag back what your experience has been. For David, what are the best place for folks to engage with you and learn more about what you're excited about?
Oh, great to ask. Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and I think it's still relatively clean and honest place to be. So people, if you're on LinkedIn, then reach out. Streetwisdom.org is where Street Wisdom, you can find all the resources and so on and so forth. As you've mentioned, Worldwide Wonder. The only other place that people, particularly if you're a business person, you might be interested in seeing what we offer on that side of things. Actually, davidpearl.net is where we hang out. But any one of those places, you'll be able to connect elsewhere. And I think the reason for doing this, apart from the sheer pleasure of meeting you, and it really is a pleasure to paddle around together and feel, wow, more of my people, but I'm your people, you're my people. It's in a world that's quite fractured, it's great to have community, growing community. I welcome people reaching out and waving. Let's just wave. We don't have to get into a transactional relationship, but just waving is very encouraging. I think we'll need more of it in the future, and just like, let's wave.
Sounds like a plan. David, thank you for sharing your wealth of experience and unique perspective on finding magic in the everyday. You have encouraged us to expect more from the mundane and to use questions in refreshing ways to engage with the world. So thank you.
My pleasure, really. It's really my pleasure.
Grateful for those who have joined us on the other side of the speakers. Thank you for being here. This conversation was all I was hoping it would be. David delivered an injection of enthusiastic creativity and challenged us to relook at the world around us. Now it's our opportunity to apply David's creative inspiration to bring a little more wonder into our daily lives. Please take all that you have learned here and be a light to yourself and to those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, and share, or comment about something that resonated. This simple action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.